more than 70 years ago, in the frozen countryside of Belgium, a story unfolded that history tried to forget. In December 1944, 11 black American soldiers from the segregated 333rd Field Artillery Battalion were captured during one of the most chaotic moments of World War II. They never returned. What happened to them was not recorded in headlines, not taught in classrooms, and not honored with monuments for decades. Their names were buried, their sacrifice ignored, and their fate quietly erased from public memory. These men were not famous generals or decorated war heroes. They were ordinary Americans, brothers, and husbands who wore the uniform of a country that still denied them full equality. They had crossed the Atlantic to fight tyranny and hatred, believing that their service might finally prove their worth as citizens. Instead, their final moments became one of the darkest and most overlooked chapters of the war. For years, the official story of World War II painted a simple picture, a united America standing together against evil, but the truth was far more complicated. While fighting for freedom overseas, black soldiers were serving in a segregated military, facing discrimination from their own ranks, and risking their lives without the recognition or respect given to others. The tragedy of these 11 soldiers exposes that uncomfortable reality. This is not just a story about loss. It is a story about silence, about how easily injustice can disappear when it challenges a nation's self-image. It forces us to ask hard questions about whose sacrifices are remembered and whose are forgotten. Before we go deeper into this history that was never meant to be told, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring hidden stories like this to light, preserve the truth, and make sure these voices are never silenced again. What happened to those 11 soldiers was not an isolated act of wartime brutality, nor was it an accident of chaos on a distant battlefield. It was rooted in a much deeper reality that shaped the daily lives of black Americans in uniform throughout the Second World War. While the nation would later celebrate victory with parades and triumphal speeches, more than 1 million black men and women who served during the war experienced a very different version of that story, defined by exclusion, contradiction, and quiet endurance. From the moment they put on a uniform, black soldiers entered a military that mirrored the inequalities of the society it came from. The U.S. Army was rigidly segregated, not by chance, but by policy. Units were separated by race, facilities were divided, and opportunity was rationed along color lines. Even as the war demanded manpower on an unprecedented scale, black service members were routinely told that their primary value lay not in fighting, but in serving others. They cooked meals, repaired roads, unloaded ships, cleaned quarters, and maintained equipment, performing work that was essential to the war effort yet rarely acknowledged as heroic. This system was built on assumptions rather than evidence. Many white commanders believed black soldiers lacked the discipline, intelligence, or courage for combat leadership, despite no factual basis for such claims. As a result, black troops were often kept away from the front lines, not to protect them, but to preserve a racial hierarchy that leaders feared might collapse under pressure. Leadership roles were tightly restricted, and even highly trained black soldiers were commonly denied the chance to command anyone outside their own segregated units. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. These men were asked to defend freedom, democracy, and human dignity in foreign lands while being denied those same principles within their own ranks. They trained under the same conditions, followed the same orders, and faced the same dangers, yet their loyalty was constantly questioned. A black soldier could risk his life in uniform one day and be reminded of his place the next, simply by walking into the wrong facility or challenging an unspoken rule. As casualties mounted and the demands of war intensified, the cracks in this system began to show. The military could not afford to waste capable soldiers, and in moments of desperation, black units were finally given chances they had long been denied. When allowed to fight, they did not falter. They proved themselves in combat zones, in the air, on the seas, and behind the lines, performing with discipline and courage equal to any other unit. Their success quietly undermined the very beliefs used to exclude them, even as official recognition remained limited. For many black soldiers, Serving overseas also revealed a painful contrast. In some parts of Europe, they experienced a level of basic respect that felt unfamiliar. They were treated as individuals rather than stereotypes, as soldiers rather than problems. These moments did not erase the hardships of war, but they planted a powerful idea that life did not have to be defined by segregation. That realization would linger long after the fighting ended. The tragedy of the 11 men in Belgium sits at the intersection of all these realities. They were trained for combat, sent into danger, and ultimately abandoned by a system that never fully accepted them. Their story forces us to look beyond the simplified version of World War II and confront a harder truth that bravery and sacrifice alone were not enough to overcome deeply embedded injustice. For Black Americans in uniform, the war was fought on two fronts, and victory on one did not guarantee justice on the other. As the war stretched on and the cost in lives continued to rise, many Black Americans began to recognize a painful contradiction that could no longer be ignored. They were being asked to fight for democracy, freedom, and human dignity in distant lands. Yet the moment they returned to their barracks, boarded a train, or stepped into a town back home, those same ideals were denied to them. This moral divide did not remain a private frustration. It became a shared awakening that reshaped how Black soldiers and civilians understood both the war and their place within the nation. Letters sent home from overseas often carried more than news of battles and survival. They carried questions. How could a country claim to oppose tyranny while enforcing segregation? How could it condemn racial ideologies abroad while maintaining them at home through laws, customs, and silent approval? For many Black servicemen, the uniform did not shield them from discrimination. Instead, it sharpened their awareness of it. Wearing the nation's colors made the injustice more visible, not less, because it exposed the gap between what America said it stood for and how it actually treated its own people. Out of this tension emerged a powerful idea that would later be known as the double victory vision. It called for success on two fronts at once: victory over authoritarianism overseas and victory over racial inequality at home. This was not an abstract slogan, but a practical demand rooted in lived experience. Black communities understood that defeating an external enemy meant little if the structures that limited their freedom remained untouched. The war, rather than silencing these concerns, amplified them. So, Black newspapers, churches, and community leaders became central to this growing awareness. They reported not only on military developments, but also on the realities Black soldiers faced in uniform. Stories of bravery were placed alongside accounts of discrimination, creating a narrative that challenged the official image of national unity. These publications did more than inform. They connected individuals across cities and states, turning private anger into collective purpose. The message was clear. Participation in the war effort entitled Black Americans to full citizenship, not conditional acceptance. For soldiers stationed abroad, this realization was often sharpened by comparison. In some places, they encountered societies that, while imperfect, did not enforce rigid racial separation in everyday life. Simple interactions, sharing a meal, walking through a town, being addressed with basic courtesy carried unexpected weight. These moments revealed that segregation was not inevitable, nor was it universal. The idea that equality was possible, even in the midst of war, quietly undermined decades of imposed limitation. When the fighting ended, many Black veterans returned home transformed. Military service had given them skills, confidence, and a sense of collective strength. They had learned to organize, to lead, and to rely on one another under pressure. More importantly, they had seen that fear could be overcome and that authority could be challenged. This made it difficult, and often impossible, to accept the old rules without question. The same discipline that had carried them through combat now fueled demands for change in their own communities. This shift did not happen overnight, nor was it free of resistance. But the seeds planted during the war would grow into a broader movement that reshaped American society in the decades that followed. The fight against injustice at home drew directly from the experiences of those who had been sent abroad in the name of freedom. World War II, for Black Americans, was not only a global conflict. It was a turning point in consciousness. The struggle for democracy did not end with the ceasefire. In many ways, it had only just begun. While discrimination shaped much of their experience, it never defined the limits of what black troops were capable of achieving. In fact, some of the most decisive moments of the Allied victory depended on their skill, endurance, and determination. Even when recognition was slow to follow, their contributions were not symbolic or secondary. They were structural, forming the backbone of operations that kept the war moving forward when failure was not an option. On the morning of D-Day, as Allied forces crossed the English Channel and advanced toward the beaches of Normandy, black soldiers were already at work in roles that demanded precision and courage. Among them were units assigned to manage barrage balloons, massive floating defenses designed to protect ships and landing forces from low-flying attacks. These soldiers operated in exposed conditions, often under fire, knowing that a single failure could put thousands of lives at risk. Their presence rarely appeared in official photographs or wartime films, yet their work helped secure one of the most important military operations in history. The invasion was only the beginning. Victory in Western Europe depended not just on capturing ground, but on sustaining momentum. Armies cannot advance without fuel, food, ammunition, and spare parts, and it was here that black troops became indispensable. As the front lines pushed deeper into France, supply routes stretched thin, and delays threatened to stall the entire campaign. To solve this crisis, the military relied on a vast network of truck drivers and support crews, many of whom were black. Driving day and night under constant pressure, they delivered what the front needed, often navigating damaged roads and dangerous conditions with little rest. Their work turned mobility into an advantage and transformed logistical efficiency into a weapon. At the same time, black soldiers were proving themselves in direct combat when finally given the chance. The 761st Tank Battalion entered the European theatre as one of the first armoured units composed primarily of black troops. Assigned to some of the most intense fighting, they advanced through towns, forests, and contested terrain, facing well-entrenched opposition. Their missions were long, exhausting, and unforgiving, yet they pressed forward, helping to break enemy resistance and liberate occupied communities. The length and intensity of their service challenged every assumption that had once been used to keep them from the battlefield. Above them, another group was quietly rewriting history in the skies. Black aviators, trained under conditions shaped by doubt and scrutiny, flew escort missions that demanded discipline and flawless coordination. Tasked with protecting heavy bombers deep into hostile territory, they faced constant danger and little margin for error. Over time, their performance earned the respect of those they protected, even if official acknowledgement lagged behind. Their success demonstrated that opportunity, not prejudice. Determined ability. What united these experiences was not just bravery, but consistency. Again and again, black troops were asked to perform under pressure, and again, they delivered. They did so while navigating a system that limited their advancement, questioned their competence, and often erased their achievements from the broader narrative of the war. Yet the record of their service speaks clearly. From beaches to supply lines, from armored columns to aerial formations, their presence shaped outcomes that mattered. In the larger story of World War II, these contributions complicate the familiar image of victory. They remind us that triumph was built, not only by those whose stories were celebrated, but also by those whose efforts were essential yet overlooked. For black soldiers, excellence became both a duty and a form of resistance, proving through action that equality was not a request, but a fact demonstrated on the battlefield. As American forces moved across the Atlantic, they did not leave their racial divisions behind. Segregation, hierarchy, and long-held assumptions traveled with them, shaping daily life wherever they were stationed. Yet when black soldiers arrived in Britain, they encountered a social environment that challenged everything they had been conditioned to expect. This contrast did not erase hardship, but it exposed a truth that many could no longer ignore. The harsh racial order enforced by the U.S. military was not universal, nor was it inevitable. For many black servicemen, their first encounters with British civilians were quietly transformative. They were greeted with curiosity rather than suspicion, conversation rather than hostility. In pubs, dance halls, and streets. They were treated as individuals, not problems to be managed. These moments were often simple, even ordinary. Segregation, but their impact was profound. Respect, when experienced after years of denial, carries a weight that words cannot easily describe. It made clear that the barriers they faced in uniform were not a natural feature of the world, but a choice imposed by their own institution. This difference unsettled American military leadership, concerned that such interactions might disrupt the racial order they were determined to maintain. Some commanders attempted to export segregation onto British soil. Informal rules were encouraged, pressure was applied to local businesses, and military police were used to enforce separations that British civilians neither understood nor supported. The result was growing tension, not between black soldiers and local communities, but between the values of the American military and the society hosting it. British civilians, segregated, many of whom had never witnessed rigid racial separation on this scale, reacted with confusion and, increasingly, resentment. They saw uniformed men who were risking their lives for a shared cause being treated with open disrespect by their own allies. When confrontations broke out, it became clear that the conflict was not rooted in local prejudice, but in an imported system of control. The presence of American racial policies began to strain relations, turning what should have been a united front into a site of moral conflict. This tension reached a breaking point in 1943 in the small town of Bamber Bridge. There, an attempt by American authorities to enforce segregation in public spaces triggered widespread anger. Black soldiers, supported by local residents who rejected imposed separation, resisted treatment they viewed as unjust and unnecessary. What followed was chaos born not from defiance alone, but from the refusal to accept an order that contradicted the very principles the war was meant to defend. The incident shocked both military leaders and the British public, forcing a reckoning with how deeply entrenched American racism had become. In the aftermath, responsibility could no longer be easily shifted or denied. Investigations revealed that poor leadership and aggressive enforcement played a central role in escalating the conflict. For once, the narrative did not place blame solely on black soldiers, but acknowledged the structural failures that led to the confrontation. While change was slow and limited, the incident marked a rare moment when the military was compelled to confront the consequences of its own policies. For black servicemen, Britain became a mirror reflecting uncomfortable truths. It showed them what life could look like without rigid segregation, and what their own country was choosing to deny them. These experiences did not fade when they returned home. Instead, they deepened an already growing determination to challenge injustice. The war had carried them far from home, but in doing so, it revealed how narrow the boundaries of freedom were back in the United States. The contrast was impossible to forget, and it would continue to shape their understanding of equality long after the fighting ended. When the war finally ended, and uniforms were folded away, many black veterans returned home, believing that their service had earned them a place in a changed nation. They had survived combat, endured discipline, and carried the weight of a global conflict on their shoulders. Yet for countless men and women, the promise of peace quickly gave way to a familiar reality. Opportunities that were advertised as rewards for service were often closed off, quietly and systematically, the moment they tried to claim them. Programs designed to help veterans rebuild their lives were administered in ways that reflected the same inequalities that existed before the war. Access to education, housing, and financial support depended not only on eligibility, but on local decisions shaped by long-standing prejudice. Many black veterans found themselves blocked from colleges, denied fair loans, or pushed out of neighborhoods where prosperity was being built. Instead of stepping into stability, they were forced to confront barriers that reminded them their sacrifices had not erased old boundaries. Even more painful was the climate of hostility that awaited some of them. Military training had given these veterans confidence, discipline, and a sense of dignity, qualities that unsettled those who wanted the old social order restored. In certain communities, simply wearing a uniform became a source of tension. Acts of intimidation and violence sent a clear message. Returning home did not guarantee safety, respect, or belonging. The contrast between what they had fought for and what they were offered could not have been sharper. Yet something fundamental had changed. The war had exposed black veterans to new ideas, new environments, and new possibilities. They had seen societies where segregation was not enforced in daily life, where respect did not depend on race alone. They had learned to organize under pressure, to rely on one another, and to challenge authority when necessary. These experiences did not disappear with demobilization. They became tools for a different kind of struggle. Across the country, veterans began to speak out, organize, and demand accountability. They joined civic groups, supported legal challenges, and helped build networks that would later form the backbone of a broader movement. Their voices carried the authority of service and sacrifice, and their resolve was shaped by the knowledge that freedom was not an abstract idea, but something they had defended with their lives. The fight for equality was no longer theoretical, it was personal. In this way, the war became a turning point. What had begun as a conflict against oppression abroad helped ignite a sustained challenge to injustice at home. The experiences of black veterans bridged two eras, connecting the battlefields of World War II to the streets, courtrooms, and classrooms of post-war America. Their determination helped push the nation toward change, even when recognition came slowly. The story you have just heard is not only about suffering or injustice. It is about resilience, courage, and the long road toward dignity. Thank you for taking the time to listen and reflect on this history. If you found this story meaningful, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep these stories alive and ensures that voices once ignored are finally heard.